All right, today's lecture is going to be an overview of chapters 25 and 26 in your textbook. Um, these chapters respectively deal with 25 deals with the aftermath of World War One, and 26 deals with the lead up to World War Two and the aftermath of World War Two. Now, these two chapters stand in pretty significant contrast to what we saw in the earlier chapters in this course. In the earlier chapters in this course, we've pretty much seen an uninterrupted accumulation of power by the West. The countries of Europe and North America, United States, later Canada, and as well as the European countries. During the period that we're looking at from the end of the 16th century until the beginning of the 20th century, have an uninterrupted period of growth and strength and increasing confidence until it reaches the point where during the period of colonization in the 19th century, where people in the West, largely from on what they considered to be scientific terms, saw themselves as fundamentally superior to other people in the world that they were controlling. Now, World War One really undermined this sense of superiority. World War One, or as the British call it, the Great War, was at that time the most destructive war in the history of the world. Killed over 10 million people, lasted many years, and really saw really bloody damage. And as a result, major powers came out of it much weaker. That sense of confidence was undermined, and people did not quite have the faith and progress and the assumption that things would always get better that they had had previously. And really importantly, there was significant economic damage as well as political damage that resulted from the war. In particular, with the losing country, Germany, they went through a period of really horrible inflation. Their government was undermined. They ended up with a democratic government that they really didn't want. And so things were very terrible for them. And so what we see is that what had been kind of an overall tendency towards increasing acceptance of democracy, popularity of the idea of representative government, what we see is that really declined. That a lot of people really felt that democracy and representative government wasn't helping them. Especially when the war was over, people were poor, people didn't have money. And especially for countries, like for instance, like Italy, which had a democratic country, which had had a democratic government, for 60 years prior to the ascent of Mussolini. They had been on the winning side of World War One and ended up not getting anything really in the negotiations after the war. And so what we see is that among the people of Italy, we see a real willingness to accept undemocratic government, especially when they had a leader, Mussolini would appear, who talked about, making Italy a strong country. He projected himself as a tough guy, as a real alternative to democracy. He also saw himself as in opposition to communism. There was a lot of support for communism, especially among industrial workers. But among a lot of people who had small businesses or who were maybe small-time managers, landowners, a lot of these people liked the idea of a more authoritarian government, but they did not really want communism. And so what we see is that under Mussolini, we see the development of what becomes known as fascism. And and he takes over in 1922. And what we're going to see is that in the 1920s, going up into the 1930s, there's a steady drift towards these really authoritarian governments that talked about nationalism, talked about traditional values, uh, were strongly anti-communist, and who really appealed to people who felt that they had been left out, people who felt that uh, the world wasn't fair to them, that they weren't getting the things that they deserved, and told them that they would come out better. And what we see is that in countries uh, like Italy, that were on the winning side of World War One, it was popular. Japan, for instance, did not lose anything during the war, but they didn't really get what they wanted in treaties. And so we see that in Japan, there's a movement towards a more authoritarian government. Eventually, in 1931, democracy is overrun, and they end up with a very nationalist government. And of course, in Germany, we see ultimately the rise of the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party eventually takes power and gets power permanently, or at least until the end of World War II in 1933. Now, Hitler actually had tried to get power in 1924, but was defeated. And it just so happens that America, in order to stabilize Europe, because, after the war was over, Europe was really wiped out. And so, really, for the first time, America really emerges as the strongest country in the world. However, the thing to understand about America is that in the period after World War One, although America was the strongest country in the world, there really was not a desire on the part of most Americans to really project power in the rest of the world. Now, that would change after World War II, but that's a ways off. However, one of the things that Americans did do was to come up with the Dawes Plan, which pumped money into Germany, which allowed Germany to pay off its reparations, the money that it owed the countries that defeated it in the war, and that stabilized the European economy. And so what we see is that, at least for a short period of time, from about 1924 to 1929, the economy stabilized in Europe. And so once the economy stabilized, that really kind of killed the appeal of the more radical, sort of government. Now, as I said before, this kind of authoritarianism was very popular among people who were more conservative. However, it was not the only kind of authoritarian government that popped up during this time. Now, in particular, in Russia, we see that the Soviet Union came into existence, towards the end of the, towards the end of the, towards the end of World War One. Now, the Soviets, they came into existence because there had been a strong Marxist movement in the country already for a very long time. And because Russia, had performed so badly in World War One, the government of the Tsar had collapsed, and there was an attempt to try to have a more democratic form of government, but it failed. And so ultimately, the Bolsheviks, these were the Marxists who believed in the idea that you needed a small group of professional revolutionaries to spearhead a revolution. They eventually get power, and they establish the Soviet Union. Now, interestingly enough, the initial leadership of the Soviet Union was under Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And Lenin developed what was known as the NEP, or the New Economic Program, in which he really gave a lot of autonomy to farmers, small farmers, especially people that the Russians referred to as kulaks. These were more well-to-do peasants. And these people were allowed to make a profit, make money, and so therefore they were very much encouraged uh, to produce. And so during this period from like 1925, from about 1921 till about 1925 or so, things stabilized in Russia and did better. But Lenin died very young, and Joseph Stalin ended up coming to power. And Stalin initiated the 5-year plans. And so, as your book mentions, Stalin really, instead of international trade, he went into the exact opposite direction. He developed, as your book always talks about, autarky. You know, the idea of having a completely independent economy. And also, quite significantly, he pushed the idea of having a command economy, not a market economy, not an economy where stuff is produced because of demand, but an economy where things are produced because the government tells folks that's what you're supposed to make. And Stalin, depending on how you measure him, was quite successful. The Soviet Union, you know, from the 1920s into the 1930s, at a time when the rest of the world was going in very, very bad shape economically, produced a lot of stuff. There was great economic growth. However, it was done at the price of massive suffering among millions of people. There were periods of starvation. And in particular, Stalin didn't trust anybody. And so at certain times, you know, he picked on certain folks. I mean, for those of y'all who watch the news, you know, the war between Russia and Ukraine is in the news a lot. You know, almost 100 years ago, during the time of Stalin, he was very leery of the Ukrainians, and he came very close to starving that country to death because he didn't trust them. You know, he took all the food out there because, you know, Ukraine is a very productive agricultural territory, and so he took the food out and left the people there to starve. And so, you know, that's just a little bit of background. You know, when people talk about the war there now, you know, a lot of the antecedents to the current bad blood go back a long ways. And that's only part of the story, but that's just a little background. But the point to be made is that there were authoritarian governments on the left and on the right. There were more right-wing authoritarian governments than left-wing authoritarian governments. However, the Soviet Union would end up being a major world power in the 20th century. And the period after World War I is where it gets its start. Now, Marxism, the ideology of the Soviet Union, had a very strong appeal among a lot of laboring people, you know, factory workers, people who were wage earners. You know, as I said before, fascism was a little bit more popular with people who had some independence, small business owners, or maybe people who were managers or professionals. Marxism had a lot more popularity among working class people. And what we eventually will see, and this is something you see towards the end of chapter 26, is that Marxism ends up being very appealing to a lot of people outside of Europe, in particular in Asia. We see that China, for instance, by 1949 becomes the second major Marxist country in the world. And we see major Marxist movements developing in Indochina, which nowadays is Vietnam, and other countries in the Indochina region, like Laos and Cambodia. They eventually have major communist movements. And there are other areas that have communist movements. And in particular, what we see is that communism has a certain appeal to colonize people, because many of these people ultimately looked at the Western countries that, you know, were democracies and said, you know, look, these countries may have democracy. They may have democratic governments, but the democratic governments are only for the people in the colonizing country. The people who are colonized don't have access to democracy. And so as a result, many of these people really find Marxism more attractive. They say, well, you know, look, we don't really have democracy. You know, why should we worry about Western style democracy? We're not getting any of the benefits of it. And so, you know, really, that's one of the great appeals of communism. Now, in the case of China also, China has a big border with Russia. And the Russians, you know, during the period when you have the major conflict between the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists, from time to time, the Soviets do support the Chinese communists. And so, you know, they do get actual material support at different times. But the main thing to understand is that people in Asia, many of these people just simply did not have a lot of faith in Western style democracy because they did not see where it had been applied to them. Now, the other thing I want you all to think about is and this, really is the question of why is World War II so destructive to colonial empires? Well, the simple answer is that World War II is the most destructive war in history. World War I weakened Western colonial powers, but World War II pretty much destroyed a lot of these countries. France was completely defeated. Britain was never occupied, but Britain went bankrupt fighting the war and lost, millions of people. Or hundreds of thousands of people might be more accurate. But, it was very devastating. So when the war was over, these colonial powers really were very weak and did not really have the strength to hold on, especially to their colonies, especially the larger ones in Asia. It's not an accident that India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, modern day Sri Lanka. It's not an accident that all of these countries became independent pretty quickly after the end of World War II. Because the people there were tired of colonialism, and the governments just did not have the power to hold on to them anymore. It's really interesting. And now, probably one exception to this was in the Philippines, because the Philippines had been held by the United States after the Spanish-American War. And the Americans basically, they looked at the Philippines and said, we really don't need to hold on to this as a colony. There are rich people in the Philippines that will cut a deal with us. We can leave the government in their hands. We can pull out. They're agreeing to let us have military bases. And, let the country be independent. We don't need to be here as big bad colonizers. We can just pull out. I mean, really, from the American standpoint, it really kind of fit in with the American political ideology of freedom, that sort of thing, liberation. Why hold on to the colony? Just let it go. And they're independent, and you can still do business with people. And also, from a practical American standpoint, it undermined the appeal of communism because you put power back in the hands of local people. Now, ultimately, the thing that the United States did in letting the Philippines get its independence really kind of plays into the final thing that we see developing in this period, and that's the Cold War. And that's because during World War II, the Soviet Union and the Western countries, United States, Britain, France, and Canada, all these other Western countries, they ended up joining together to fight the Germans, the Japanese, the Italians, the various Axis powers. But, and the United States gave billions of dollars in military assistance to the Soviet Union in order to arm them so they could fight against the Germans. Because, one of the things that you always have to remember about World War II is that the overwhelming amount of actual fighting against Germany was actually done by the Red Army. The Russians did most of that fighting. I mean, we're talking from 1942 to 1945. The Russians were heavily engaged in ground combat and aerial bombardment with Russia, with Germany, and gradually pushed them back. I mean, ultimately, the Russians would inflict about 7 million casualties on the Germans. And so this really nasty, bloody war. However, the Soviet leadership, especially under Stalin, he was the ultimate leader. He didn't die until about 53 or so. Fundamentally did not trust the West. And so as the war came to an end, uh, the trust and cooperation between the Soviets and the Western powers broke down. Now, ultimately, the British and the French, as I said before, they were broke. They had been beaten down by the war. The country that emerged from World War II with all the power was the United States. Remember, I said at the end of World War I, the United States ended up as the most powerful country in the world, but the political will was not there to really exploit that power. After World War II, it became clear to the American leadership, and President Truman was the leader at this time, that the United States did not have the option of walking away. The United States, at the end of World War II, had about 75% of all the industrial capacity in the world, had the richest economy in the world. And so the United States used its money in order to see to it that Western-style free markets and capitalism would dominate in the areas that it controlled. On the flip side, the Soviets saw to it that they were able to implement their ideology in those areas that they controlled. And because the Soviets had done the bulk of the fighting in Europe, they ended up controlling a big chunk of Eastern and Central Europe. And then also because of the geographic nature of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the biggest country in the world, just as Russia now, which is the smaller version of what the Soviet Union is still the biggest country in the world, and borders a huge part of Asia. And so this meant that the Soviets were geographically in an advantageous position to influence much of Asia, and eventually were able to spread influence in other parts of the world. And so the Cold War really is the competition between the two countries that in different ways came out of World War II the strongest, the Soviet Union and the United States. They have different ideologies, diametrically opposed ideologies. Both want to be in control, and both have different things to offer. The United States can offer money, success, the ideology of freedom. The Soviets are able to say, look, we believe in egalitarianism, we believe in anti-colonial struggle. And so you have a major struggle that develops over about 45 years, known as the Cold War. And the fundamental reason behind that is a very strong ideological difference in the way these two powers saw the world. Well, anyway, class, I hope that this outline gives you all a better idea on how to approach the 4 questions that I gave you for exam number 3. Hope this is helpful to you. Have a good evening.